Okay, good. So, recording has started. Welcome everyone to this session hosted by the Digital Architects Network, but the content is from Dr. Adina Aldea from LeanIX, who has done some fascinating research on enterprise architecture, and she has their very own view on that. And she is going to talk about this for the next hour. We have a little time to run over, but hour 50 minutes, if necessary, hour and a half, but I think we will be finished by then. Okay, without further ado, Adina, the floor is yours, so please go ahead.
Yep, thank you, Peter. Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see you here in this session, and as Peter mentioned, I have been doing all kinds of different activities with enterprise architecture for the past, getting closer to 12 years now. I've worked also as a consultant before, and I've also gotten my Ph.D. in enterprise architecture and was an university docent at University of Twente, where I also worked for a couple of years there. So I have different perspectives on enterprise architecture, and today I will be telling you a bit about one of those aspects, and I'll also be sharing my screen to start out with that. I think you can see my screen. I think, at least, if everything's good with the presentation on it. Yep, I guess. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
So, yeah, thank you. So the idea is that what we will be focusing on today is a bit more of the data-driven enterprise architecture. I know maybe most of you are familiar to more the model-driven enterprise architecture, which is more based on languages like ArchiMate. And today we're going to be discussing a bit more our perspective at LeanIX and a slightly different way of doing enterprise architecture. And also we'll be telling you today a bit about insights from our customers. We just reached the 1,000 customer mark not too long ago. So we will also be sharing today a bit some insights from that. Before I go any further, the presentation that I have prepared for you today is actually also going to be published as a paper in Springer proceedings, and this is just a part of that. So if you're wanting to also read a bit more about it in the future, it will be, I think, available somewhere in July. Because of the agreement we have, I also need to mention that that is actually the source material. Okay, so to start out, I also want to tell you a couple of words about LeanIX. I'm not sure many of you have heard about LeanIX before. If you have, maybe you can raise your hand in chat, then I can at least have a bit of an idea of where we stand.
Nope.
No, I see a couple of people have raised their hands, but I think the majority have not heard of LeanIX. So then I will also, yeah, that's nice. At least some people have heard of it. Just to give you a small introduction, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's not supposed to be a commercial presentation. LeanIX was founded in 2012, so a bit over 10 years ago. By our founder, one of the founders, Andre Christ, who was had a bit of a similar role to an enterprise architecture position at that time, and he was working at DHL. And at DHL, he was struggling with the fact that he was gathering a lot of information in Excel spreadsheets, and it was always out of date, and he had to travel from one location to another to gather information about the architecture. And again, he was seeing that his results were not good because it was continuously out of date. So then he came up with the idea for LeanIX, and I'll be telling you a couple of words about that, but also not too much about it. As I told you before, we got our 1,000th customer not too long ago, which was Mars. So we celebrated together with them. We've also have around 500 employees now, and we also are based on public funding. To tell you a bit about the type of customers we have, it's not just one industry, it's all kinds of industries, and it's also not only in the Netherlands or Germany. We also have a lot of customers abroad from the US and other countries. As you can see, we have even tech companies, and this also tells you that if tech companies trust us, then probably we're also doing something right. Maybe there are some names in here that you might recognize. Of course, we have DHL, Atlassian, Dropbox, and all kinds of other companies like Volkswagen and Bosch. But maybe also to make it a bit more concrete and a bit more relatable to you, I added also a couple of Dutch customers that we're having. These are not the only ones, but these are just a couple of names to give you an idea of what we have in the Netherlands as well. Here you can see all kinds of different industries, starting from universities to retail companies and other types of industries. And just a couple of words, what is actually LeanIX? We try to, well, whenever we try to explain LeanIX, the easiest way we can explain it, it's like it's the Google Maps for software. So the principle is the same. With Google Maps, it helps you get from point A to point B, and it helps you by providing information of the different routes and the different options that you have. And it also does it in a way that is visually appealing and also simple, that everybody can just intuitively start using it. So that's also the concept that we're trying to go by with LeanIX, to make it easy for everybody to use and to give you this nice visualization that you can understand and make decisions on how to get from A to B. So from as-is architecture to to-be architecture to try to transform your organization. And again, just to tell you a bit about this, we have actually 3 products. Enterprise Architecture Management is just one we'll be focusing a bit on today, and more specifically, we'll be focusing on the vision and the principles we have for enterprise architecture. But we also offer 2, let's just say, newer products, which are Value Stream Management, which is more specifically tailored for organizations that develop their own software and have their own product organization, their own product teams. And on the other hand, we also have the SaaS management platform, which is more suited for finance and procurement teams to get a handle a bit of the SaaS that is being purchased by the organization. So this is just to give you a bit of an understanding about what we're doing. I think this was it. Indeed, that is the last slide about LeanIX. As I said, I don't want to go into too much detail because that's not the purpose of our session today. More the purpose of what we're going to talk about today is what kind of vision we have for enterprise architecture and what we think is a good approach for this. As I mentioned before, I think most of you are probably familiar with this kind of model-driven enterprise architecture, which is based on ArchiMate. In a lot of situations, this is something that expert enterprise architects are using on a daily basis to document the enterprise architecture. And we think that that is great. But we also think that maybe it's we have this approach where we think also other stakeholders within the organization should be involved. And that's why we think a data-driven approach that is a bit more understandable for a wider audience is the way to go for us and for our customers. And to give you a bit of an idea for this, if we look back at what this link should not be in there, it was for a different purpose. But if you're interested, you also can have the link to the careers. I forgot to remove it. The idea is with an enterprise architect that you should be able, of course, to communicate with the different groups within the organization, whether it is with the more technical parts of your organization that know the ins and outs of the technology architecture and can plan these kind of rollouts of the infrastructure within your organization, to the more strategic colleagues that are more business oriented and maybe even C-level. And the enterprise architect should be able to navigate between these different layers within the organization. And that also brings us back to our view on enterprise architecture, and that is more that we want all of these different stakeholders not only to communicate with the enterprise architect, but also to interact with enterprise architecture themselves and to contribute directly. And this, I think you might know this book from Gregor Hope. It's quite famous by now. The idea is that enterprise architecture should not be just policing the information, but it should also have a lot more freedom, and a lot more freedom comes with collaboration and information from different types of sources. So what this also comes with this is the idea of democratizing enterprise architecture. Coming back to what I said before, that a lot of different stakeholders within the organization should have access to the information and should be able to contribute to it. And what we consider when we talk about democratizing this enterprise architecture is that a simplified meta model is also key to this. So whereas languages like ArchiMate are extremely valuable for being extremely detailed in modeling your enterprise architecture. If you're thinking about democratizing and extending the enterprise architecture practice to the whole organization to some degree, a simplified meta model would have a bit more reach and it will be easier understandable. Another part of this is, of course, visualizations that are easy to understand by all stakeholders. And that means, as I said before, this idea that it should be like the Google Maps, right? It should have visualizations that are relatable to people and that you don't need a lot of domain understanding to understand what they're trying to communicate with you. And of course, the idea is that you also have within the organization this collaboration between different roles, that the enterprise architect is not the sole responsible, but that they can very easily make use of information and support from different roles within the organization. And of course, finally, the most important part in here is, of course, the ability to use information from different sources. And we also consider that this should be done by integrating with different sources and not per se only by gathering manual data in an enterprise architecture tool. But you can also think of integrations with, for example, CMDBs or any other kinds of tools that can provide relevant information for an enterprise architect. Also, if you have, I didn't mention this before, if you have questions, you can also put them in chat. During the presentation, I'll try to keep my eye on that and answer as we go. Otherwise, at the end, you probably will have the opportunity to ask any questions that you have. And speaking of this simplified meta model, this is kind of the idea with this. If you look at this, you see that it's kind of a similar concept to what you have, for example, in TOGAF and ArchiMate. So you have these different layers that deal with the basic elements of enterprise architecture. So business architecture, application and data architecture, and technical architecture, the same as you have in ArchiMate or in TOGAF. These are just common elements in here. And of course, things like strategy and transformation to actually promote the creation of this to-be architecture. So to also have the transformations within your enterprise architecture. And the core idea of what you see with this is what I mentioned before, that people can immediately understand what this meta model is about. So when they see a visualization based on an application or a business capability, this is something that would be easy to relate to and not something that needs a lot of training or understanding to basically to understand how to use this. Of course, I'm not also saying that no training is necessary or that everything is just simple and easy, because that is not the reality. But the idea is with something more simplified like this, it becomes also easier to reach a broader audience. And the idea is, if you take away this complexity and focus only on a couple of elements that are understandable by people and that you can actually collect data for, the idea is that you can create these automated types of reports, which you can see in here. This is the example of an integration report in which you see how the different applications are integrated and exchanging information between each other. So this is also something that can be created automatically based on such a data-driven approach. Similarly, diagrams can also be created in the same way, because once you have this information, you can just expand as much as you want and see the direct dependencies between all the different elements in which you have in here. So a data-driven approach doesn't mean you actually don't create models. It just means that the way that you capture data and the way that you focus on this data is from a data-driven approach. So think about something like an Excel spreadsheet. Data like that is structured in table format can be used to actually generate these types of diagrams. So that's a bit the difference between the perspective of a model-driven approach versus a data-driven approach. For a model-driven approach, you create your data by modeling this kind of model by hand. On a data-driven approach, you gather the data and then generate this kind of model or report afterwards. So that's a bit about the paradigm and the idea that we have, and the reason that we think that this is an important way to do enterprise architecture, again, because this makes it a bit more reachable for different types of stakeholders within the organization. And now this part is a bit more to focus on what we see as current challenges that enterprise architects are facing at the moment within our customers, but also just different types of companies I've interacted with over the years and so. Well, this probably should not come as a surprise to you that we're seeing this more and more switch from these, let's just say, long projects that are relatively stable, so that have a start and an end date and run for a couple of years. And the idea is that the organization changes only once in a while, more to this continuous transformation type of approach, where the idea is to test and to try to change to have a lot of transformations happening at the same time within the organization in parallel, and to think about all kinds of different scenarios and different ways to approach this. Well, this approach has been already there for quite a while. It's more and more companies are seeing this as the way to go nowadays. And as you can also see on the left side, we have some data from a survey by McKinsey that 70% of transformation projects fail. And that also happens because it is very difficult sometimes, especially when you have these kind of very big projects that have also a huge investment, to also see if these projects are still on track and to also at one point take a decision to stop these projects. Whereas if you have this approach of more smaller projects and continuously transforming the organization, it's a bit easier to identify how these projects are going, are they still on track, and should I just keep going in this direction, or should I actually change my direction and cancel these kind of projects? And what we see as some of the most, or some of the biggest changes that have happened, it's not only recently, but let's just say in the past 5 to 10 years, we see that now it's become more and more, let's just say more and more tools have the ability to expose their APIs, and more organizations can use these APIs to interact, to create integrations, to extract data from one system and to the other. Now it's become a bit more like the standard. So it is actually very good for an enterprise architect, because on the one hand, you have all this information at your disposal, but on the other hand, it also increases the complexity within your architecture, because a lot more systems are integrated with each other. So if you're trying to make any kind of transformation, it becomes more and more difficult because of all these dependencies that you have to deal with. A second one also shouldn't come as a big surprise, I think, is that SaaS is a trend that is here to stay, even in the industries that are the most traditional. A lot of SaaS applications are starting to be used, and more applications, more and more organizations are trying to go to this cloud first or cloud native type of state, where they try to get rid of all kinds of legacy on-premise systems and have only SaaS applications. This, of course, has also a lot of risks, because SaaS applications are very easy to purchase. You only need basically the credit card of the organization, and you can just purchase a SaaS application. So this is also a challenge for enterprise architects to try to keep track of all the SaaS that the organization has in a good way. And finally, I wouldn't say this is the last trend, but this is just the last one that I wanted to highlight. It's become increasingly more easy for different members of the organizations to actually create applications. And there are not these kind of applications the size of SAP or Salesforce or any kind of Microsoft application, but they are more these kind of micro applications that are specifically constructed for purpose. So, for example, to create an application for someone on the work floor that is, for example, working in a warehouse, and that has to fulfill a bunch of different tasks, and he has this application that he can just say, okay, I check mark, I've done this, this, and that, and then the data gets pulled to a central repository where all kinds of analysis can be run on it. So these are the types of applications that are being developed, but it also means that a lot bigger audience within the organization can actually create applications. And it's not only applications that deal with, let's just say, low sensitivity data, but it can also be with data from customers or employees or any other kind of sensitive data that should not be accidentally exposed publicly. So that also, on the one hand, makes it easier to create your own applications, but on the other hand, of course, it again creates a lot of complexity for enterprise architects, because they need to be aware of these applications and manage them in a good way and integrate them in the rest of the landscape. And speaking of SaaS management, this is something that is actually based on some of our customers, and this is something that maybe you also have experienced, or maybe this is something that you recognize. What you see in blue is number of SaaS applications that these customers have responded that they have when we first had contact with them. And this is, as you can see, the number in gray, so the total number is actually the number of applications that they have. And this goes back to what I said. This is one of the things that enterprise architects struggle with quite a lot nowadays, to actually manage the SaaS landscape. You think you have a certain number of applications because these are the ones that are purchased by the central IT organizations, but in the end, you actually have a lot more than you thought, because it is actually so easy to buy a SaaS application. So this is then one of the main challenges that we see. And besides this, of course, things like communicating within the organization about the changes that need to happen, about the things that, about the employees and how they're being impacted by changes in IT, and all these kind of things are also on the list of topics that are very challenging for enterprise architects, for our customers, but also just companies that I've spoken to over the years. I'm not sure if maybe this specific picture that I'm showing maybe this is something that is also recognizable for you. You don't have to say a lot, but maybe just raise your hand or just say something in chat, because I'm very curious. This is something that has shocked me a bit, to see how big the difference is between what people think exists and what actually exists within organizations.
Yeah, I concur. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. I'll also take a short sip of water. And when we look, because this also has a bit to do with the maturity of the enterprise architecture practice, what you see, these differences between the number of SaaS applications that are actually, that organization actually has compared to the ones that they know about. And this comes, this maturity that I present here is also a bit more tool-related maturity. Of course, you have different types of maturities and maturity scales and all these kind of things. This is more from the perspective of how good are you at gathering the data, analyzing it, and making decisions based on it. You could also, it's not about LeanIX, it's just in general, how good, even though you see the name LeanIX in there, it's more like in general. So we see that quite some customers and also companies that I've spoken to are in the first phase, where we see that Excel, Visio, and PowerPoint, or any other kind of tool like this, is actually being used for documenting the enterprise architecture. While this can be a very good step to start an enterprise architecture practice, this can be very difficult if the organization ends up being very complex, or if it grows a lot. Because you don't have the single source of truth, you have different references, different teams or so might have a different version of the same enterprise architecture, let's just say. What we see is that once an organization starts having an enterprise architecture tool, this changes from just spending a lot of time on gathering information and making sure that everybody has the same version of it, to actually being able to start making some analysis, some true analysis, and to actually make some decision based on this. And this is where we see, as I said, organizations that just start having a bit more mature enterprise architecture and are using an actual tool. And from step 3 on is where organizations start becoming more and more mature. So what I mentioned before is that you can integrate data from all kinds of different sources, so you don't have to only rely on the data that you have as an enterprise architect. You can have information about the technology landscape from a CMDB, and you can have information about cost from any kind of these kind of financial tools that you might have, where you have information about the costs of different applications. But if you have a business process modeling tool that you document all kinds of business processes, that information can also be very useful for your enterprise architecture practice. And this is the step in the middle, is where a lot of organizations are actually going towards. But we see that actually the most value comes after this point, right? You have all of your data, and in step 3, where it's automated from different sources, so you can take all kinds of different perspectives. And in step 4 is actually where you start looking at making not only decisions based on what you have within the landscape, but you also start thinking a bit more strategic, a bit more business outcome driven. So you start thinking about how you can also fulfill the business needs of the organization, and you start becoming the people who innovate within the organizations and the people who truly drive the change from an enterprise architecture perspective. And finally, for the last step, is where we see that enterprise architects are truly seen as the internal consultants within the organization. So you have this trust because you have proven in the past, based on the data that you have, that you can truly add value to the organization and make these kind of future-proof decisions to change the architecture. So this is kind of what we see. And as I said, quite some of the companies that we talk to are actually in the first phase, the ad hoc phase. Some are in the transparency focus in the second phase, and only a few are actually in the third phase of an integrated and automated data. So as we see, there's plenty of room for improvement in here. And I think this also has to do a bit with the enterprise architecture practice itself, because if you have to spend a lot of time documenting information to make decisions, you might not have enough time to be the consultant and be the forward thinker that actually brings the organization to the next level, because you have so many things that you need to do within the organization, especially if you don't have any kind of integrated data from different sources. So other colleagues within the organization can provide you the information that you need. And this is, for this part, it's a bit more of an idea about how we help organizations with the challenges. It's not about, again, it's not about promoting the tool or so, it's more about the practices and the kind of situations that these organizations are facing and how they came to a solution with it. And to start out, this is a survey that we ran last year. And we asked different organizations, okay, what are their IT priorities? And I think maybe this is also something recognizable for you, that upgrading legacy systems is one of the priorities. And this also goes a bit hand in hand with expanding the cloud infrastructure, because in many cases, when you're upgrading these legacy systems, you might not want to upgrade the on-premise ones as another on-premise version that is just up to date and supported by the vendor, but you'd rather choose a cloud option because it's a bit easier to manage. So it should not come as a surprise that 40% or so of the respondents have said that this is a major priority for them. At least I hope it doesn't. And to give you a bit of an example, I think Sienna should be a recognizable name for you as an organization. And they're also an organization that has struggled a bit with this idea about modernization of their infrastructure. And because they just started growing more and more and became more of a global entity, they had to rethink a bit about how they deal with their enterprise architecture practice and their IT landscape. And with this, it also came the realization that it was not really practical for them to self-host so many different technologies because they wanted to be able to be a bit more flexible and to anticipate the needs of the customers and to expand even more globally. So yeah, as I mentioned, the main challenges were all kinds of legacy systems, mainframes, varied databases, and this could not also be integrated into new systems and further developed. And maybe, as I mentioned also to you before, something to note in here is that also their architecture was documented in Excel and Visio. So if you look at it from this perspective, they were on the first stage of their enterprise architecture maturity, at least from the data perspective and the way that they handle it from a tooling perspective. So with this in mind, this was the problem, and their idea was that they wanted to change from developing their own applications, from having these very heavy legacy systems, to actually purchasing ones that would be a bit more easily configurable. Of course, not everything could be easily outsourced to other vendors because they also had very specific systems in place. And besides replacing all of these systems, they also wanted them to, they wanted some transparency about their enterprise architecture landscape and this kind of accountability to understand who is responsible for the different aspects. So what they ended up doing, Of course, they had to get a better understanding of their as-is architecture. So yes, with the help of LeanIX, but they went to the level where they documented their current architecture. And one of the most important parts is they had a lot of obstacles for collecting data. As I mentioned before, if only the enterprise architecture team is focused on collecting data and maintaining the enterprise architecture, on the one hand, this is very much a full-time job. And on the other hand, you also might not have access to all of the knowledge that people have. So for example, think about things like functional fit. This is the idea behind functional fit, is how well is an application supporting the needs of the people using it? How well is it supporting it and supporting them and the tasks they need to perform? So this is information that you don't normally have access if you just have your enterprise architecture models or information from enterprise architects. So that was the idea for this, that they wanted to expand the practice and to get different types of information to be able to make better decisions. Besides this, as I mentioned before, they wanted to have some more systems that were developed by companies so that they could they could buy from these companies and not develop everything by themselves. So they created all kinds of evaluation criteria for understanding how they can make these decisions. So for example, they looked at which systems were necessary to be actually self-developed because they were so custom and they fit the purpose so well, and which systems could actually be replaced by purchased applications. On the other hand, also they looked at their own development methods, if they could be agile or waterfall, or these kind of decisions they had to take in this period of time. And as I mentioned also before, one of their goals was to actually make sure that they had transparency over this change. So it was very important for them that every employee had access to this information so that they understand how it impacts them, and that they could also contribute maybe with their concerns ahead of time, and they could also later on add relevant information, things, for example, like the functional fit that I talked to you a bit before. And besides the fact that information should be available for every employee, that it would help with this, it also helped with identifying all kinds of redundant applications, reducing costs, and also helped with understanding what kind of dependencies there would be between these applications and truly get a grasp of the landscape that they had. And to give you a couple of examples of things that they did, of course, I cannot show you information from these customers because that is confidential. But I can also tell you a bit of the tools that they use for making these kind of decisions. So this is a kind of a portfolio analysis in which you can analyze all kinds of different things. In this case, you can look at your application landscape and you can analyze it from different perspectives, like functional fit that I mentioned to you, technical fit, cost, business criticality, and all kinds of different perspectives. And in this case, the technical fit versus functional fit, and what you see in here is actually a time analysis. I think maybe you are familiar already with the time analysis. This is something that Gartner is promoting. They also created the time analysis, but it is an easy way to understand how you can deal with the different applications in your landscape. So for example, in here in the bottom left corner of the screen, what you can see is these applications have a low functional fit and a low technical fit. So the end users are not happy with how this application supports their needs for the tasks they need to perform. And on the other hand, we also have the technology supporting this application is also not great. So these kind of applications here in the bottom left corner are actually very good candidates for elimination. Whereas if you're looking at the top right corner, you also see these applications in here with a good technical fit, a good functional fit. These are ones that you will actually tolerate, that at the moment you don't actually need to do anything with. Whereas if you start looking a bit more here to the left, you have applications that have a very bad functional fit, but the technology behind them is actually good. So these are the applications that you might think, okay, maybe if I invest some money in this, maybe if I develop some things by myself, or if I purchase additional modules from this provider, then maybe the functional fit of these applications can be improved. So these are the ones in which you would normally think about, yes, an investment might make sense. And finally, these ones on the bottom right corner are the ones that have a good functional fit, but the technical part is not great, which means that they're probably hosted on premise on a legacy system. So these are also prime candidates for migration to the cloud or migration to, for example, a different type of technology supporting them. So these are the types of analysis that were also used by CNA to get a bit of an understanding of which applications they want to keep as is and which applications they might want to purchase from vendors in the future based on the information that they gathered from different stakeholders within the organization. And as I mentioned before, the dependencies and the integrations that these applications have play also a very critical role, especially if you're thinking about removing any kind of application from the landscape. If you're looking at something like this, like HR admin, it's very easy to see here that it's an application that is fairly well connected. And this could be the first step in your analysis to figure out, okay, what would be the impact if I try to replace this application with a different one? So again, this type of analysis is critical in such modernization initiatives, and this is also something that CNA has used to get a bit more insight into the impact of the changes they wanted. For the next one that I want to also share with you, it's a bit about mergers and acquisitions. And this is also based on a survey that we ran recently. And what you see in here is, I have to say, on the left side, before I read the survey, this information quite surprised me, because I was not aware that, I knew, of course, organizations can have a lot of mergers and acquisitions in a year, but it also surprised me on how many there can be. And what actually surprised me even more is when I talked to a company and they said that they have more than 10 mergers and acquisitions every year, which, if you think about it, that you need to assimilate 10 companies every year, it's quite an impressive feat if they are able to do this in a good way. So this is also one of the reasons why companies are searching for an enterprise architecture tool. They want to expand their or to increase their maturity in general of their enterprise architecture practice, because this is not something that you can do if you don't have a good understanding of your as-is situation, at least. And here's what you can also see on the right side of the screen. It says that IT transparency is one of the main priorities for a good M&A process. And that makes sense, because you cannot plan to incorporate the landscape of a completely new organization if you don't have a good understanding of your current as-is situation. And another thing that completely makes sense in here is that when you are assimilating another company via merger or an acquisition, you have to understand that this other company, of course, has a lot of overlap, because they have similar processes and they use similar or maybe completely different applications. So this is also a very big part of the process of M&A. And these basically are all the tools that you would also normally use in any kind of transformation that you have within your organization. But it's even more important in this situation, because in the case of M&As, this assimilation of another company might need to happen a lot quicker than other transformations that you might be doing in your organization. And it has a really large impact, considering all these new employees that are now part of the current organization. So there's a lot of complexity and a lot of impact in the cases of mergers and acquisitions. And this is a bit the idea of the case of Helvetia, who is a large insurance company from Switzerland. And in 2014, so already quite a while ago, they merged with another big insurance company from Switzerland, because they wanted to have a larger spread and to cover a bigger customer base. And when you're dealing with insurance organizations, like some of you might also be familiar with, there are a lot of different types of requirements and restrictions, and a lot of questions that maybe for companies in different industries you would not need to ask as with such a high priority. So, for example, I think, like, how does this change the risk profile? This is something that for insurance and banking sector is extremely important. So it needed to be that this merger, during this merger, they were very much aware of how this would impact their risk profile. So a lot of analysis and careful migrations needed to happen. Of course, as I mentioned before, synergies, this is something normal that happens in any kind of merger and acquisition. And to see what kind of mapping between these two domains of the two different companies can be done to see where there are dependencies or where are overlaps between applications. And for them, of course, when you're talking about insurance companies, also other organizations probably face the same restrictions. You need to make sure that the operations continue as usual. You cannot have your customers trying to access one of your services and not be able to actually do something that they want. So claim some kind of, do a claim on an insurance that they have, or get some information that they need, or if they're in the process of some kind of insurance investigation, that you need to be able to access the services. And of course, the processes between the two organizations were relatively similar, and they had to see how these can be integrated and where there was overlap. What they ended up doing is what I also mentioned to you before, that in many of these kind of situations, it's not only about the information that an enterprise architect has, but it's especially for this kind of very large transformation, very useful information, and can reside also with other stakeholders, but it's also very important to have good communication. So in their situation, they actually use tools like Confluence to document the changes that were going to be happening within the organization, so everybody could have access to simple information about how this change would happen. And of course, all kinds of architectural information was also posted in there to be able to, for people to have a bit better understanding of what the impact would be. Also tools like Jira, where you can do all kinds of project planning, and all kinds of other tools similar to Jira are very important, because especially in these kind of organizations that are developing their own software or have a bit more agile approach, doing this project management with these tools like Jira is actually very common. So it's important that there is a connection between what these project teams are doing in tools like Jira and what an enterprise architect is developing in their transformation plan for the architecture. Another thing that was very important for them was to be able to show what is the overlap. Where do these two organizations have similar applications or different applications used for the same purposes, to be able to reduce any kind of redundancy. And of course, finally, the idea was that, as I mentioned before, not only that people have access to this kind of information, but that you also have on-demand analysis and reports, so that people can know at any point what stage the transformation is at, what are the next steps, and what happens. And to look a bit at the types of analysis that can help with this, such a matrix types of analysis, where you look, for example, at the different departments or the different teams or the different business entities on one axis, comparing it to, for example, the business capabilities or the processes, and in the middle you have the applications. You have already an idea of, for these types of business capabilities or business processes, I have these applications for these business units. So if you look at the different entities that you have from the two different organizations that are being merged, you can clearly see if there's overlap between applications that are being used. And if you combine this with any kind of analysis of things like functional fit, so how happy are the end users with how this application serves its purpose for these processes or business capabilities, then you can also help make better decisions to say, okay, then I will keep application from company A instead of the one from company B, because the end users are happier with this. Or combined with information about cost or technical fit or any other kind of information to figure out which of the two versions to keep from company A or company B. So these types of analysis are very useful in these kind of situations. I've also shown you before a bit the idea of integrations, but I showed it to you a bit more simplistic view. of course, when you look at integration, it's good to know what the dependencies are so that you see, okay, which application depends on a lot of different information from other applications. But sometimes it's also important to dive a bit deeper to understand, okay, how is this data flow going through these applications? So if I have information from this application, where is it being used? Because it's not only about the direct relations, it's not about the direct dependencies. But for example, in this situation, if HR admin is an application that provides employee data to all of these other applications that are using it, it's not only the direct dependencies that are important, but also the indirect ones. Because the same information might also, a bit augmented, might travel also to other applications via indirect relations. So such a view like this can give you an idea about how the information travels through the organization, and maybe even how which data each application is managing. And this type of visualization is also important when you think about if you need to do, for example, for GDPR, you need to do these kind of audit reports where you think about, okay, what kind of data do I have in these applications? How is it being processed, and what is the sensitivity of these types of data? That is also important, and especially for someone like for an insurance company, this is something that is very critical to them. I see that you have a question.
If I'm allowed to.
Sure, please go ahead.
We are looking at a view that is concentrated on applications and showing the data flow. While I was expected in a data-driven model that you put the data entities in the center, and then see which is mastering, which application is mastering, which has a copy of it, and so instead of, this looks like every application owns a set of data which is copied or flown through it, while the entity is the data. So I would expect the other way around.
Yeah, that is also possible. So it depends on what you want to do, right? It's always the question of what kind of analysis you want to do. At this level, if you're looking at to see how the data flows between applications, and at this level, I feel that it's good to be application-centric because you're looking at how these applications are connected. But of course, if you want, especially for these kind of GDPR cases, you can put data to the top and then see exactly like you explained. So this is just a view, an example of this. But of course, it's all flexible. I don't want to say a lot about the tool, but essentially, whatever analysis you want to do, and if you talk about data-driven, maybe that's also something that I need to emphasize a bit more. When I talk about data-driven, an application is also a data point, right? The name of the application, the functional fit, technical fit, business criticality, and those kind of things. So if you think about from this perspective, everything in here is a data point. And that is more what I talk about when I say data-driven enterprise architecture. It's not that only the data objects that you see in here are important for the changes within the organization. Maybe that's also something I should have emphasized a bit in the beginning, but I think your question now helped me to clarify it a bit what I mean by this. So thank you. Maybe also to move on a bit, looking at the time, to move on to the third case that I want to a bit talk to you about is this is called SAP S/4HANA transformation. You can also read this as ERP transformation in general, or any kind of big transformation within an organization. So the idea is that, especially in certain types of industries that you're talking about, like manufacturing or so, ERP systems are very big and they are very spread. But this is also something that has surprised me over the years, hearing a bit more about these kind of ERP systems. Because when I started out quite some years ago with enterprise architecture, I was hearing about all these kind of SAP or Oracle, these kind of big ERP systems. And I assumed, okay, an organization has one ERP system. Of course, it's spread through the whole organization, so it's a very critical system. But what I've learned over the years, and what you can also see as the results from these kind of surveys, is that organizations have a lot of ERP systems. And in many cases, these ERP systems are not connected to each other. So seeing as these systems are quite different from each other, in some situations that they have a completely different data architecture. So it's also it's also difficult sometimes to properly exchange data between them. And as you see, so many organizations, even from this sample that we have more than 25 ERP systems. So this is something that can be very difficult to come from all of these different systems to transforming to only one, because you have to be very careful with all the data and all the customization that has been done in these very specific smaller ERP systems when you're transferring to, let's just say, a bigger one. So this is one of the cases that we had for Marco Polo. They're also a fashion and retail company. They're a bit similar to C&A, but they're actually quite a lot bigger because they have a much wider online presence. And because they grew so rapidly over the past couple of years, they had to develop a lot of things on demand, which meant that they ended up in this situation where they had a lot of custom ERP systems in all the different types of locations. And these ERP systems were not integrated. They needed a lot of data sharing and a lot of communications between them, but this was not something that was happening. And they decided this was not what they needed anymore. They really needed only one system so that they could expand globally easier, so that they didn't have a lot of differences regionally in all the different countries, for example. So of course, this needed a bit more holistic information about the landscape that they had. And when we're looking at this kind of SAP or big ERP transformation, it's a very huge, impactful transformation. So this means in some situations, like in their case, that they had to reorganize things from scratch, and that they had to standardize a lot of different things that were different in the different countries that they had entities in, and all the different systems that they were using. Another requirement for these kind of things, I think this is something that is not only for retail organizations, but for a lot of different industries that you have, especially when you're making a transition of these kind of critical systems. From one system to another, you need to have both systems running at the same time for a very long time, not only to ensure that there's no discontinuation of the service, but that you also give your employees enough time to be retrained and to get adjusted and to transfer all the data from one system to another to make sure there's a good migration. So of course, with this, you also need, because you need to also retrain employees, and it's a very impactful change, you need to have all this kind of documentation, and you again need to have transparency so people understand how they're being impacted. And by having this transparency, it becomes also a bit easier to involve people and keep them motivated over time. I think actually the most complex thing that they had to do for this is that they had to do this transformation within 2 years. So if you had to do within your organization any kind of transformation is similar to this kind of scale, you can understand that in most cases, 2 years is an incredibly short amount of time. In most cases, organizations that deal with these kind of huge ERP transformations take up to 5 years or even longer to make sure that it's done properly, and that all the customization that was done in the previous system can be to some degree reproduced, or at least that they have a working version that they can still deliver the same services, they can still support the same processes. So it is a very complex task. And what I mentioned to them, the goal was, of course, to keep people involved and motivated. And because of that, one of their the things that they did is they actually had a team of 80 employees that were initially onboarded for this project. Not all of them were actually enterprise architects. They were from different types of roles, because they wanted to make sure that there was a good collaboration between business and IT, that you didn't have only this IT project that the business said it's important, but they had no insight and involvement in. Because if they were properly onboarded and properly kept informed about the progress of this project, they could also contribute their opinions and make sure that this project was running according to plan. So in order to do this, of course, people needed to have access to this kind of information, different types of roles within the organization. And of course, when you're talking about these kind of ERP systems, they're only as good as the data that they have. And the data that they have is not only from the system, but it's also integrated from different types of systems. So of course, they had to develop a lot of integrations. And maybe a bit slightly unrelated to this specific initiative, but for Marco Polo, it was very important at the time and still is to have a good understanding of the sustainability of their IT practice. And to understand this, it's also important, of course, to have an understanding of your landscape. And to go in a bit more detail about these kind of things that they did. Of course, when you are trying to do any of this kind of transformation, the most important thing that you can do is have a good understanding of your as-is architecture. But once you have this, you can start thinking about different types of implementation scenarios. So especially with something as complex as this, there's not one right answer to do it. There are a lot of different ways in which you can achieve similar results. So one of the things that was very important was also to be able to create these kind of scenarios and think about what would be the best way to transition from where they are to where they want it to be. So when you're thinking about this, you're thinking about things like impact analysis and gap analysis, where you can see the differences. And it can be simple differences, for example, like seeing that a certain application is removed from the landscape, so is no longer supporting this type of business capability or process, or for example, that new interfaces are created or a technology is replaced to create a bit better functional fit, technical fit, I mean. But it can also be for things like, for example, because you have replaced the technology supporting an application, that also the technical fit of the application changes. Or maybe you have changed the number of licenses that an application that you purchase for a certain application, and then the overall cost for that application has decreased or increased. So all of these kind of things are things that are important to document when you're thinking about doing this kind of transformation, because there are a lot of things that are being impacted and a lot of different perspectives you need to keep in mind for this. So this is a bit the idea. And not only that you can look at the as-is architecture and the to-be architecture, but that you can also see all kinds of different kind of transitional architectures. So you can see how this transformation is happening over time. And when you're talking about these transitions, of course, all of these transitions happen in projects. So it's also very important to have a good understanding of how your project landscape looks like, what the dependencies are, and also what is the impact of these projects on your landscape. So on applications, on technology, and different things within your architecture. And this was also something that was important for them to understand, especially since they had different kinds of scenarios they were evaluating. And finally, this is one of the final parts. I think I will spend maximum a couple of minutes on this. And this is about where I see and we see that there are some opportunities for... is my audio still fine?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. So this is where we see that enterprise architecture should also focus on in the near future. I mentioned before with Marco Polo that they had this Green IT initiative, and that it was very important for them. This is also where we see that there will be more focus in the near future for enterprise architects as well. So whereas sustainability is a topic that is very hyped at the moment, everybody's talking about sustainability. From an IT perspective, sustainability is not really a topic that is receiving a lot of initiative, a lot of emphasis for companies at the moment. So this is something that we think in the future will need more and more attention and more understanding of how do you actually look at sustainability from an EA perspective. So these are just a couple of questions that you can think about. What kind of goals related to sustainability should my organization align themselves to? And if I have this kind of sustainability goals within my organization, how are they actually implemented by my architecture? And to be a bit more concrete, from a perspective of sustainability, you can also think about where do you have any kind of waste? Where do you have duplications in your applications? Where do you have a lot of legacy technology that is not only costing a lot and causing a lot of issues because it might not be supported, but also from the perspective of consumption that you can maybe replace with something newer or with a cloud option. And we don't think it's the job of the enterprise architect to look at the sustainability of the cloud itself. So to think about all of these kind of things. This is more when you make the decision, okay, do I deploy in this cloud or that cloud? But it's more about what I mentioned before, that you think a bit about, do I have inefficiencies in my architecture? Do I have a lot of applications that are not really being used, but are still run and kept operational? Do I have a lot of self-developed applications that are deployed even in the cloud, but have unoptimized code? These kind of things are ways in which just a bit of a snippet on how you can look at this as an enterprise architect. Of course, risk and security, this is not per se a new topic at all. It is something that is growing more and more in importance, though. And not only risk and security analysis as a concept, like security frameworks or so, but also having a bit better automated analysis to see where you have vulnerabilities within your organizations, so you can actually take action before there is a huge impact on your organization. And if you think about self-developed applications, and it was already, I think it's already more than around a year ago, but this was this whole Log4j situation where there was this one library that had a huge vulnerability, and a lot of applications were being developed using this library. And we also saw it with our customers, we also saw it with ourselves, and it was all over the news that it took organizations a lot of time till they discovered where all these vulnerabilities were happening, because it's not easy to have an insight in this unless you have some kind of automated analysis to figure out where the vulnerabilities actually lie. So that was a bit more for self-developed applications, but you are also thinking, we're also thinking about applications that you purchase, other types of vulnerabilities within the organization, and other types of analysis that you can do. And the funny thing is, I actually wrote this paper and did this presentation originally quite a while back. I think it was 7-8 months ago, before the era of ChatGPT. So I think it was quite a timely presentation that I made. The idea that you can use all kinds of machine learning, artificial intelligence type of algorithms to help you in your enterprise architecture practice. So of course, on the one side, when your organization wants to use machine learning or AI in general, you have, from an enterprise architecture perspective, to make sure that you have the proper technology in place to support the initiatives from the organization. But from the other perspective, these new tools now that are being developed, but also tools that don't exist yet, would make for a very great companion to an enterprise architect to help you with analyzing different aspects of your architecture, to give you actually recommendations of how you can do certain things, how you can modeling patterns, and all these kind of suggestions that can help you in your enterprise architecture practice to not have to do all of this kind of manual analysis, but you already get recommendations to help make sure that you spend time on the value-adding activities and not per se on the ones where it's just about manually identifying certain things. So this is the final slide for this. The idea that I was talking a bit about today is the shift from this kind of model-driven analysis a bit more to a data-driven analysis, where based on having all this data in your repository, you can generate automatically reports and diagrams and different kinds of aspects and from different perspectives to do analysis to help you make decisions. And maybe also another important aspect of this data-driven enterprise architecture is that it should not be only for the highly well-trained enterprise architects, but also different members of the organization should be able to get a say in it and to contribute to actually benefit from the information that is stored in an enterprise architecture repository, but also contribute to it in different ways. And regarding the challenges, I mentioned to you that a lot of the organizations that we're talking to have a relatively low enterprise architecture maturity, which means they don't actually have an enterprise architecture tool or an enterprise architecture practice in place that can help them to deal with these kind of complexities that they're facing. And I gave you a couple of examples of typical types of situations that we see, which is modernization of the landscape, these kind of mergers and acquisitions, or even big transformations like ERP transformations. And finally, three points that we think should be emphasized further, and even tools should develop functionality for, is to figure out how to assess the sustainability from an EA perspective, these kind of automated risk and security analysis, and also to take advantage of all kinds of new developments in the field of AI. So that was a bit from me. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm wondering, I know we had, I think, one question during. I'm wondering if you have any other questions that I can help answer for you at the moment.
So thank you, Adina. That was very impressive. Any questions? I have a couple.
Sounds good.
Okay, so you talk about a paradigm shift, about data-driven architecture, where, as Ron was alluding to, data is central in everything you do. How does that, a couple of questions, how does it work with existing methodologies such as TOGAF, all that stuff? Yeah, how would you do that? But what most intrigues me is that basically, now, traditionally, we're talking about intentional architecture. Yeah, we have from A to B with a couple of steps, with decision making, developing architecture principles, etc., etc. You picture it as a look at the data, look what's in the organization, collect all the data, see what's in there, and then we have our architecture. Or do I see that wrong?
I don't think that is per se wrong. I think the approach of data-driven architecture is relatively similar to what you have for model-driven architecture. I think the traditional enterprise architecture that is done with frameworks like ArchiMate or TOGAF, it's not that much different from that. In that situation, you also need to gather different data points from different sources to be able to see what your current situation is and to try to think about what your future can look like. I think the main difference is that if you look at this data-driven architecture, it makes it easier to gather information from different sources because you don't have to worry about how this information will be visualized, what kind of models you will create. So it allows you to gather this data. It doesn't mean you have to be not selective about the data that you gather. It's about quality, it's not about quantity, but it makes it easier to gather data from sources, for example, like a CMDB like ServiceNow, or any other kind of sources like that, because you are gathering the data and then you figure out which perspective do I want to look at this data from. So instead of first saying, I want to have this model for this specific situation, you have the data and you think, okay, I can look at this information from different types of perspectives. So the idea is that it makes it easier for you to shift. So when you normally create a model and you see, for example, what kind of applications and technology are supporting a specific process and what kind of data is necessary for all the process steps. If you want to say, yeah, I want to change now the perspective and I want to look at the capabilities that these applications are doing, or I want to change just completely the data that I have, you need to start again and you need to model and shift elements in the diagram. The idea with this is that with data-driven enterprise architecture, you already have the data in there because you've collected it. If you haven't collected it, of course you can collect it, but you can always switch perspective relatively quickly and say, now I want to look at the relation of these applications to a capability instead of to a process. So it's more about how easy it is to shift from one perspective to another, rather than a completely different paradigm that is not aligned at all with frameworks like ArchiMate or TOGAF, because still there are a lot of elements in common between the two. It's just the meta model is slightly more simplified than what you expect from a TOGAF meta model or an ArchiMate meta model.
So basically the premise is that there is an existing situation. And suppose you start with an empty sheet. You start with a bright idea. Yeah, and
that
there's
happens.
no data.
That happens, of course. There are many companies that we also speak to that don't have a lot of data available. And in that kind of situation, of course, you start with what's most important for you and what's most important for the analysis and the decisions you need to make. So if your current focus at that time is that I want to have a bit more understanding of the integrations my applications have because I want to replace something within my organization, then you start with trying to document some applications that you have, their integrations and the data that they're exchanging. So this is then the level that you start at. The reason I'm saying it's a bit easier is because what you have to do in this kind of data-driven approach is as simple as putting data in an Excel spreadsheet. You don't have to worry about how you will visualize this data, or do I need all of this data or just like 2 or 3 different data points. This is the information that I gathered from different stakeholders within the organization. I start with this, and then when you create the visualizations, you start seeing how you want to look at this data and how you want to analyze it. So that's what I meant is a different way of looking at it, because with models, you say, I start with doing these here, and you don't maybe document more than you actually need. Whereas for the other perspective,
you fill in the model, in fact, you fill in the model. And
yeah, exactly.
With your approach, your paradigm, you create the model.
Afterwards, indeed. And then you can think about what kind of analysis do I want to do? Because maybe the model you created is not the right one if you do the model-driven approach. Maybe you want to make some changes to it. And if you want to change perspective on it, you have to put a lot of effort into creating a new model. So that's why it's a bit more of a difference in the starting point and the flexibility of what if something changes in my organization. For models, the data, of course, changes in the repository, but the model itself might not change. Because you don't know if there's something new. What if there's a new application supporting this specific process? You don't really see it, right? Because models in most situations are static. But if you think about the data-driven approach that you automatically generate these kind of reports, it automatically pulls all the data you have from a repository. So you always see, hey, there's a new application supporting this process. So the whole paradigm for this one is that it should reduce the amount of work you need to do, because the visualization gets generated for you, and you only need to focus on gathering the information and not so much in generating the visualization yourself.
And how does it tie into architectural artifacts like principles, standards, architecture principles, architecture standards, and all that?
Well, I would have to say that it ties into it the same as you would do with any kind of model-driven approach. So for this kind of data-driven approach, of course, you can have all kinds of principles that you have. It probably wouldn't be called a modeling principle, but it's an enterprise architecture principle in which you look at what kind of information is important and how certain patterns should be modeled, in the sense of what kind of relations you should emphasize, what kind of metadata should be gathered, and all of these kind of things for specific scenarios, for example. And if you're thinking about all kinds of other frameworks that you want to implement, so if we're talking about, for example, security frameworks like ISO or NIST or so, these kind of frameworks can also be implemented. And the idea is that they basically, if you talk about the security control, a security control is always associated to something like an application that it's supposed to be implemented in, for example. So then the idea is that you gather this data similarly to how you did before for your enterprise architecture models, how you would do it in a model-driven approach. It's just you say this control should be related to these applications, and all kinds of metadata that is related to this. So you would gather it, for example, also in an Excel spreadsheet in a relational table that is relating the application to the control. So then you can also import all of these kind of controls that you have, and then you can decide how these are related to different elements within your architecture. Again, at the data level, and then you can decide how you want to visualize these relations.
Yeah. Okay, I need some time to have it sink in, but it was very interesting, Adina. Thank you. Any more questions? Did my questions raise new questions? Okay, great. So, well, thank you again. I assume you sent me a PDF version of the deck, and
Yes.
I will post it, and I will upload. I still haven't found the button in MS Teams to upload. But thank you very much, Adina, and hope everyone enjoyed it. So see you next time at the Digital Architects Network. We will post the stuff on the knowledge base and on YouTube with recording. So great. Thank you all, and
Okay. Thank you very much.
Have a nice evening.
For organizing.
Nice evening.
all right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you, bye.